The university campus buzzed with activity as students hurried across the quad, their voices creating a symphony of excitement on the first day of the new semester. Among them walked a young woman whose presence seemed to blend into the background, like a single brushstroke in a vast painting. Her brown hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, her clothes practical rather than fashionable, and her eyes, though bright with intelligence, were often cast downward as she moved through the crowds. This was Lynn, a 24-year-old graduate student who carried her notebooks close to her chest like precious treasures. She wasn't shy exactly, but she had learned early in life that staying quiet often meant staying safe from judgment. The mathematics department, where she studied, was housed in an imposing stone building with ivy climbing its walls, a place where brilliant minds had made discoveries for over a century. Lynn had arrived at this prestigious university through a path unlike most of her classmates. Growing up in a small coastal town, she was the daughter of a fisherman and a seamstress who worked long hours to keep food on the table. Their home was modest, with thin walls and uneven floors, but it was filled with love and encouragement. Lynn's parents hadn't finished high school, but they recognized something special in their daughter's quick mind. By age 6, Lynn was solving arithmetic problems meant for children twice her age. By 12, she had taught herself algebra from a tattered textbook found at a yard sale. The local library became her sanctuary, where she would spend hours absorbed in advanced mathematics books that the kind librarian would order from other branches just for her. That girl's got numbers in her blood, her father would proudly tell the other fishermen, though he himself couldn't help her with homework past the 4th grade. Despite her natural talent, Lynn's journey to higher education wasn't smooth. Her high school had no advanced placement classes, and her math teacher, while well-meaning, couldn't challenge her growing abilities. She took to studying late into the night, using free online courses and solving problems by the light of a desk lamp while the rest of her family slept. When college application time came, Lynn's guidance counselor suggested community college as the realistic option, but Lynn had other plans. She applied to top universities, writing essays that revealed her passion for mathematics and describing how she had taught herself calculus and number theory through borrowed books and internet resources. The scholarship offer from the university came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Her mother cried, her father stood speechless, and Lynn felt a mixture of elation and terror. She would be entering a world completely foreign to her family's experience. Now, 3 years later, Lynn was beginning her graduate studies after completing her undergraduate degree with honors. Yet despite her academic success, she still carried herself with the same unassuming manner. Her fellow graduate students came from prestigious preparatory schools and had parents who were professors, doctors, and engineers. They spoke with easy confidence about summer research, positions in international conferences they'd attended. Lynn slipped into the advanced theoretical mathematics classroom and chose a seat in the back corner. The room gradually filled with students greeting each other like old friends, comparing notes on their summer adventures at math camps and research internships. No one sat next to Lynn, not because they disliked her, but because they hardly noticed her at all. She removed her notebook from her backpack, not a sleek laptop like most students used, but an actual paper notebook filled with her neat, precise handwriting. Lynn preferred to work through problems by hand. There was something about the physical connection between brain and paper that helped her think more clearly. The classroom door swung open with authority, and Professor Winters strode in. He was a legend in the field of non-Euclidean geometry, with numerous published papers and a reputation for brilliance, matched only by his impatience for mediocrity. His steel-gray hair and piercing eyes gave him the appearance of an eagle searching for prey as he surveyed the classroom. "Welcome to Advanced Theoretical Mathematics," he said without a smile. "If you're looking for an easy credit or a gentle introduction to graduate-level math, you're in the wrong room. I expect excellence, dedication, and original thinking. Nothing less will be tolerated." Lynn felt a flutter of anxiety in her stomach, but also a spark of excitement. This was why she had worked so hard, to learn from the very best, to challenge her mind in ways that weren't possible in her small hometown. Professor Winters began a rapid-fire overview of the course, covering the syllabus in half the allotted time and diving straight into complex concepts that left some students frantically taking notes. Lynn listened intently, her mind making connections and seeing patterns in the equations he wrote across the board. When he posed a question about topological manifolds, the classroom fell silent. Lynn knew the answer. It had been covered in a paper she'd read over the summer, but years of staying invisible made her hesitate to raise her hand. A confident voice broke the silence. "The invariant must be preserved under continuous deformation," said a young man in the front row, his tone suggesting the answer should be obvious to everyone. "Partially correct, Mr. Reynolds," said Professor Winters. "Anyone care to elaborate?" Lynn took a deep breath and raised her hand halfway. To her surprise, Professor Winters noticed. "Yes, Ms. Lynn," she said, her voice soft but clear. "The answer requires specifying that we're dealing with a closed manifold, since the boundary conditions change the invariant properties." Professor Winters raised an eyebrow. "Correct. Have you studied this before?" "Just some reading on my own," Lynn replied, feeling the eyes of her classmates turn to her with newfound curiosity. The professor nodded slightly before continuing the lecture, but that small moment felt like a victory to Lynn. For once, she had been seen after class as students filed out. Lynn overheard whispers. "Who's that girl in the back? The one with the old school notebook?" "No idea. First time I've noticed her." Lynn pretended not to hear as she gathered her things. She was used to being overlooked, and in some ways it had been protective. Flying under the radar meant fewer chances for rejection or ridicule. But a part of her was tired of invisibility, tired of her ideas existing only in the pages of her notebooks rather than in conversation with others. As she walked across campus toward the library, autumn leaves crunched beneath her feet. The mathematics building loomed behind her, both intimidating and enticing. Lynn thought about her family back home. Her father, who would be returning from the sea about now. Her mother, who would be finishing the day's sewing work. They had sacrificed so much for her to be here. In this place they could barely imagine. The university library rose before her, a temple of knowledge with massive columns and wide steps leading to its entrance. Inside was her favorite spot, a secluded desk by a window overlooking the campus pond, where ducks swam peacefully, untroubled by mathematical complexities or social hierarchies. Lynn settled at her desk and opened her notebook to a fresh page. The problem Professor Winters had mentioned as something to think about was already forming in her mind. Numbers and symbols arranging themselves in patterns only she could see. This was where she felt most herself. In the pure abstract world of mathematics where it didn't matter what clothes she wore or how she spoke. All that mattered was the elegance of her thinking and the truth of her solutions. As the afternoon light filtered through the window, casting a golden glow on her notebook, Lynn lost herself in the problem. Her pencil moved across the page, creating a dance of symbols that reflected the unique way her mind worked. She didn't notice the hours passing or the library gradually emptying as evening approached. What Lynn didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know as she worked in solitude, was that in the coming weeks, her life would change dramatically. The talent she had nurtured in quiet obscurity was about to be thrust into the spotlight. The plain woman in the back of the classroom, so easy to overlook, would soon become impossible to ignore. But for now, she was simply Lynn, a fisherman's daughter with an extraordinary gift, finding her way in a world that had yet to recognize what she had to offer. And perhaps that was about to change, one equation at a time. The mathematics building looked different in the rain. Water streamed down its stone walls, darkening the ivy and giving the whole structure a somber appearance. Lynn hurried up the steps, shaking droplets from her worn jacket as she entered the warmth of the hallway. She was early, as usual, but today she paused outside the classroom door, gathering her courage before entering. 3 weeks into the semester, Lynn had discovered that raising her hand once had changed things, though not entirely for the better. She was no longer completely invisible, but the attention that came with being noticed wasn't always welcome. Some classmates, particularly Reynolds and his friends, had taken to watching her with skeptical eyes whenever she spoke, as if waiting for her to make a mistake they could pounce on. Lynn pushed open the door and found the classroom half full. A group of students huddled near the front, laughing over something on a phone screen. They glanced up as she entered, their conversation dropping to whispers. Lynn kept her eyes forward as she walked to her usual seat in the back, but she couldn't help noticing Reynolds' smirk as she passed. She pulled out her notebook and began reviewing her notes from the previous class. Professor Winters had covered a particularly challenging concept in multivariable calculus. and Lynn had spent hours in the library working through the problems he'd assigned. Her solutions filled several pages, her neat handwriting becoming increasingly cramped as her excitement grew with each breakthrough. The classroom gradually filled with students, their voices creating a buzz of conversation that Lynn had learned to tune out. She remained focused on her notes until Professor Winters strode in, silencing the room with his presence. "Before we begin today's lecture," he announced, "I'd like to discuss the problem sets from last week." He held up a stack of papers. "Most of you managed to solve the first 3 problems adequately, though with varying degrees of elegance. The 4th problem, however, proved more challenging. Only 2 students found the correct approach." Lynn sat up straighter. She knew her solution to the 4th problem was correct. She had checked it multiple times and even derived an alternative proof to verify her answer. Mr. Reynolds provided an efficient solution. Professor Winters continued, nodding toward the front row. Reynolds straightened his shoulders, accepting the praise as his due. And Ms. Lynn took a more unconventional approach but arrived at the correct answer nonetheless. A few heads turned toward Lynn, some curious, others doubtful. She felt her cheeks warm but kept her expression neutral. She had learned long ago that showing too much emotion, whether pride or hurt, only gave others power over you. Professor Winters placed the papers on his desk and turned to the board. "Today we're moving into non-Euclidean geometry, which some of you may find counterintuitive at first. Your understanding of space is built on assumptions that we will now challenge." He began writing equations across the board, his hand moving with practiced precision. Lynn followed his logic, seeing the beauty in the mathematical structures he was describing. Non-Euclidean geometry had always fascinated her. The idea that parallel lines could meet, that the shortest path between 2 points might be a curve. It was like discovering a whole new world with different physical laws. As Professor Winters explained a particularly complex concept involving hyperbolic planes, Lynn noticed something that didn't seem right. The equation on the board didn't match what she knew about the curvature of these spaces. She hesitated, weighing the risk of speaking up against the importance of understanding the material correctly. Finally, she raised her hand. Professor Winters paused mid-sentence. "Yes, Ms. Lynn? I'm sorry, but I think there might be an issue with the constant in that equation," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "If we're describing a hyperbolic space, shouldn't the value be negative?" The room fell silent. Questioning Professor Winters was rare enough, but suggesting he had made a mathematical error was practically unheard of. The professor turned back to the board, studying the equation with narrowed eyes. After a moment that seemed to stretch forever, he picked up the eraser and corrected the sign. "You're right," he said, his tone clipped. "A careless error on my part. Thank you for the correction." Before Lynn could feel any satisfaction, a voice cut through the silence. "Maybe if some people spent less time looking for tiny mistakes and more time understanding the bigger concepts, they'd actually contribute something valuable," Reynolds said, loud enough for everyone to hear but directed at no one in particular. A few students laughed nervously. Others looked uncomfortable. Professor Winters frowned but continued his lecture without addressing the comment. Lynn stared at her notebook, her face burning. She knew Reynolds' remark was aimed at her, suggesting that she was nitpicking rather than truly understanding. The unfairness stung. She had spent countless hours studying these concepts, often going well beyond the assigned material. And she hadn't pointed out the error to show off. She had done it because getting the mathematics right mattered. The rest of the class passed in a blur. Lynn took notes mechanically, her earlier enthusiasm dampened by the incident. When Professor Winters finally dismissed them, she packed her things quickly, hoping to leave before anyone could say anything more. As she stood to go, she overheard Reynolds speaking to his friends. "Honestly, who does she think she is? Some nobody from nowhere with her paper notebooks acting like she belongs here." His friend chuckled. "Did you see what she was wearing on Tuesday? My little sister has better fashion sense and she's 10. I heard she got in on some diversity scholarship," another added. "They probably had to fill a quota." Lynn walked past them with her head high, pretending she hadn't heard, though each word felt like a small cut. Outside in the hallway, she leaned against the wall for a moment, taking deep breaths to steady herself. She hadn't expected university to be easy. But she hadn't anticipated this kind of targeted unkindness either. A voice beside her broke into her thoughts. "Hey, don't listen to those guys." Lynn looked up to see a fellow student, a quiet girl named May who usually sat near the front of the class. "They're just mad because you're smarter than them," May continued with a small smile. "That was good what you did in there. The sign matters, it changes the whole model." Lynn returned the smile gratefully. "Thanks. I was just trying to understand it properly. Well, some people can't handle being shown up, especially by someone they've underestimated." May adjusted her glasses. "I'm heading to the Math Help Center to work on the new problem set. Want to join?" The invitation surprised Lynn. She had grown so used to working alone that the idea of studying with someone else felt strange. But also nice. "Sure," she said. "I'd like that." As they walked together across campus, Lynn felt a small weight lift from her shoulders. Maybe she didn't have to face everything alone here. The Math Help Center was located in the basement of the science building, a large room filled with tables, whiteboards, and struggling students. Lynn and May found a quiet corner and spread out their notes. They worked through the first problems together, Lynn finding it surprisingly enjoyable to talk through her thinking with someone who followed her logic. "How did you learn all this?" May asked as Lynn explained an elegant approach to a particularly tricky problem. "You seem to know things that weren't even in the textbook." Lynn hesitated, unused to talking about herself. "I read a lot," she said finally. "In my hometown, there wasn't much to do, especially in winter. So I ordered books through the library and taught myself." "That's impressive," May said, and she seemed to genuinely mean it. "Most of us had advanced classes and fancy math camps, and you're still running circles around us." Lynn shook her head. "Not around everyone. Reynolds is really good, too." "Reynolds has been groomed for this since he was a child," May said with a hint of bitterness. "His father is some big-shot mathematician at Princeton. He's had every advantage." Lynn didn't know how to respond to that. She had never thought much about the advantages others might have had. She had been too busy overcoming her own obstacles. As the afternoon wore on, more students filtered into the help center, including to Lynn's dismay Reynolds and two of his friends. They settled at a table across the room, occasionally glancing over with poorly concealed disdain. "Ignore them," May murmured, noticing Lynn's discomfort. Lynn tried, but it was hard to focus with their eyes on her. When they finally packed up to leave, Reynolds deliberately bumped Lynn's table as he passed, causing her carefully organized notes to scatter across the floor. "Oops," he said with mock concern. "So clumsy of me." Lynn knelt to gather her papers, her face burning with humiliation and anger. May helped her, shooting a venomous look at Reynolds's retreating back. "What is wrong with him?" May muttered. "He feels threatened," Lynn said quietly, surprising herself with the insight. "He's always been the best, and now he's not sure." May studied her with newfound respect. "You're pretty smart about people, not just math," Lynn smiled wryly. "When you've been overlooked most of your life, you learn to watch and understand." As they left the building, the rain had stopped, leaving the campus washed clean and glistening in the late afternoon sun. Lynn took a deep breath of the fresh air, feeling both drained and oddly strengthened by the day's events. For the first time since arriving at the university, she had faced direct opposition, but she had also found an ally. What she didn't know yet was that much greater challenges and much greater triumphs lay ahead. The hostile environment of the mathematics department was about to become even more intense. But so was Lynn's determination to prove she belonged there, not because of any quota or scholarship, but because mathematics spoke to her soul in a language as clear and beautiful as the sky after rain. And soon, very soon, no one would be able to deny it. The lecture hall hummed with unusual energy that Monday morning. Lynn noticed it the moment she walked through the door. Students huddled in small groups, voices pitched low with excitement. Occasional glances toward the front of the room where Professor Winters had yet to appear. Something was different. Lynn slid into her seat beside May, who had taken to sitting in the back row with her over the past 2 weeks. Their friendship had grown steadily, built on shared problem sets and quiet conversations in the library. Today, May leaned over with barely contained excitement. "Have you heard?" she whispered. Lynn shook her head. She rarely checked her university email outside of class requirements, and she wasn't part of any social circles where news traveled fast. "Professor Winters is bringing some special problem today." something that stumped even the senior faculty. May's eyes sparkled behind her glasses. Apparently, he was at some conference over the weekend where they were discussing it. Before Lynn could respond, the door swung open and Professor Winters entered, his usual brisk stride now carrying an additional note of purpose. He carried a leather messenger bag that looked fuller than normal, and there was a gleam in his eyes that Lynn had never seen before, a mixture of challenge and satisfaction, like a chess master about to unveil a particularly clever move. The room fell silent immediately. "Good morning," Professor Winters began, setting his bag on the desk with deliberate care. "I had planned to continue our discussion of differential manifolds today, but something more interesting has come up." He reached into his bag and pulled out a manila folder. "I've just returned from the North American Mathematics Conference, where I had the privilege of discussing current research problems with colleagues from institutions across the continent." He opened the folder and withdrew a sheet of paper. "One particular problem in topological dynamics has been generating significant interest. It was first proposed 6 months ago, and so far, no one has found an elegant solution." Lynn sat up straighter, her full attention captured. Topological dynamics, the study of transformations on topological spaces, was an area she found particularly fascinating. She had spent many late nights exploring its concepts beyond what was covered in class. The problem involves finding an invariant measure for a specific type of chaotic system, Professor Winters continued, turning to the board and beginning to write a complex equation. The computational approach is well established but extremely time-consuming and resource-intensive. His chalk moved rapidly across the board, filling it with symbols that caused several students to shift uneasily in their seats. Lynn followed along, her mind already beginning to process the patterns and relationships embedded in the mathematical notation. "What we're looking for," Professor Winters said as he finished writing, "is not just a solution but an elegant one. A closed-form expression that captures the essential nature of the problem without resorting to brute force methods." He turned to face the class, his expression almost smug. "My colleagues at MIT and Stanford have been working on this for months. Their graduate students have written programs that run for days on powerful computers, approximating solutions, but never quite capturing the underlying structure." A hand shot up in the front row. Reynolds, of course. "Professor, is this related to the Poincaré recurrence theorem?" he asked, clearly trying to demonstrate his familiarity with the topic. "It extends beyond that, Mr. Reynolds. This deals with non-ergodic systems where traditional approaches fail." Professor Winters scanned the room. "The point is, this is considered an open problem, something worthy of a publication for whoever finds a clean solution." Lynn studied the equations on the board, her mind already racing through possible approaches. There was something about the structure that seemed vaguely familiar, reminiscent of a paper she had read months ago out of pure interest. "I don't expect any of you to solve it," Professor Winters continued with a small smile. "Even I haven't found a satisfactory approach yet. But I thought it might be instructive to expose you to cutting-edge problems in the field, to show you what real mathematical research looks like." Reynolds laughed, a sound that carried a note of superiority. "So basically, if the best mathematicians in the country can't solve it, we definitely can't." "That's not quite the attitude I'm trying to foster, Mr. Reynolds," Professor Winters replied dryly. "But yes, the probability of an undergraduate or even a beginning graduate student finding the key insight that has eluded established researchers is remote." Lynn barely heard this exchange. Her attention remained fixed on the board, where patterns were beginning to emerge in her mind. The central equation had a particular symmetry that reminded her of something she had explored during one of her late-night study sessions. "Nevertheless," Professor Winters continued, "I invite you all to consider the problem. Sometimes fresh eyes can see what experienced ones miss, and the exercise of grappling with unsolved problems is valuable in itself." He turned back to the board and began explaining the background of the problem, walking through the known approaches and why they had fallen short. Most students took dutiful notes, though it was clear from their expressions that few harbored any hope of understanding the problem fully, let alone solving it. Lynn's pencil moved across her paper, not taking notes but exploring a hunch. If she considered the system from a different angle, rotating the conceptual space, so to speak, there might be a simpler formulation hiding beneath the complex surface. "What are you doing?" May whispered, noticing that Lynn wasn't copying from the board like everyone else. Just trying something, Lynn murmured, her focus unwavering. As Professor Winters continued his explanation, the atmosphere in the room shifted subtly. What had begun as excitement about a novel distraction from routine classwork was transforming into a heavy sense of inadequacy as the true difficulty of the problem became apparent. Some students had stopped taking notes altogether, their expressions glazed with mathematical overwhelm. Reynolds, however, was writing furiously, his face set in determined concentration. Lynn had to admire his tenacity, even if she disliked his attitude. He genuinely loved mathematics and hated being bested, both qualities that drove excellence, if sometimes at the cost of kindness. To summarize, Professor Winters said, capping his exposition, we're looking for an invariant measure that can be expressed in closed form, without resorting to numerical approximations or infinite series. The key insight likely involves finding a transformation that reveals a hidden symmetry in the system. He set down his chalk and dusted his hands together. I'll leave this on the board for the remainder of our time today. Feel free to approach it as a thought experiment. Sometimes the act of wrestling with impossible problems expands our capacity to solve merely difficult ones. The classroom fell into an unusual silence as students stared at the board with a mixture of fascination and defeat. Lynn continued working in her notebook, following her intuition down a path that seemed increasingly promising. If she could just find the right transformation. Professor Winters walked between the rows, glancing at students' work. When he passed Lynn's desk, he paused, his eyes narrowing as he observed her unorthodox approach. Interesting angle, Ms. Lynn, he said, just loudly enough for nearby students to hear. Though I'm afraid you've overlooked a critical constraint in the original formulation. Lynn looked up, momentarily disoriented as she was pulled from her deep concentration. The non-compactness of the space, Professor Winters explained, pointing to a symbol in her notebook. Your approach assumes a bounded domain, which isn't the case here. Lynn felt a flash of embarrassment as several students, including Reynolds, turned to look at her with varying degrees of curiosity and satisfaction. Reynolds in particular wore a smirk that clearly said, see, not so brilliant after all. Of course, Lynn said quietly, though inside she wasn't convinced the professor was right. The approach she was exploring specifically addressed the unbounded nature of the space through a clever mapping. Professor Winters continued his rounds, leaving Lynn to her thoughts. She glanced up and caught Reynolds watching her, his expression a mixture of triumph and lingering concern. He needed her to be wrong, she realized, needed it for his own sense of place in the mathematical hierarchy. Don't let him get to you, May whispered. Even attempting this problem is more than most of us can do. Lynn nodded absently, already returning to her calculations. She had almost seen it, a path through the mathematical thicket that might lead to a clearing. Professor Winters' interruption had broken her concentration, but the glimpse remained. The remainder of the class passed in unusual quiet, punctuated only by the scratch of pencils and occasional sighs of frustration. When Professor Winters finally dismissed them, many students seemed relieved to be released from the oppressive presence of the unsolved problem that loomed on the board like a mountain too steep to climb. Remember, Professor Winters called as they packed their things. Mathematics advances through persistence in the face of apparent impossibility. Don't be discouraged by difficulty. Be challenged by it. As Lynn gathered her notebooks, Reynolds approached Professor Winters, engaging him in an animated discussion about the problem. Several other students hovered nearby, drawn to the intellectual gravity of both the professor and his star pupil. Coming to the library? May asked, slinging her backpack over her shoulder. Lynn hesitated, glancing back at the board where the problem still waited, patient and implacable. Actually, I think I'll stay here for a bit, she said. I want to try something else with that problem. May raised an eyebrow. You really think you might solve it? Lynn shook her head quickly. No, probably not. But I can't stop thinking about it. There's something there, something I almost saw. Okay, math genius, May said with a good-natured smile. Text me later? Lynn nodded, already turning back to her notebook as May left. The classroom emptied gradually, voices fading into the hallway until only Lynn remained, sitting quietly in the back row, surrounded by empty seats and filled with a growing sense that she was on the verge of something important. What she didn't yet realize was just how important that something would be, not just for the problem on the board, but for her life and for everyone who had ever been underestimated or overlooked. The next day would bring a moment that none of them, not Professor Winters, not Reynolds, not even Lynn herself, would ever forget. Morning light streamed through the tall windows of the mathematics building, painting golden rectangles on the polished floor of the hallway. Students filed into the classroom, their voices a mixture of Monday morning weariness and quiet anticipation. The impossible problem from Friday still lingered in their minds, a mathematical mountain that had humbled even the brightest among them. Lynn walked slowly, her steps heavy with fatigue. She had barely slept all weekend. After leaving the classroom on Friday, she had gone straight to the library, where she remained until the security guard gently but firmly informed her that they were closing. Saturday and Sunday passed in a blur of scribbled calculations, discarded approaches, and countless cups of tea as she worked at her small desk in her apartment. By Sunday night, something had shifted. What began as a vague intuition had crystallized into a clear path forward. Around midnight, Lynn had stared at her notebook in disbelief, checking and rechecking her work, unable to accept what her calculations were telling her. It seemed too simple, too elegant to be right. But each verification confirmed what she had found, a transformation that revealed the hidden structure of the problem, leading to a surprisingly compact solution. Now, clutching her notebook to her chest, Lynn felt a strange mixture of excitement and dread. Part of her wanted to share what she had discovered, to see if Professor Winters would confirm that she had indeed found what mathematicians at top universities had missed. Another part of her, the quiet girl who had spent her life avoiding attention, wanted to keep the solution to herself, safe from potential ridicule if she had somehow made a fundamental error. Lynn slipped into the classroom and saw that Professor Winters had preserved the problem on the board. It stood there unchanged from Friday, its complex symbols a challenge to everyone who faced them. Students settled into their seats, many casting resigned glances at the board. Few had likely spent their weekends wrestling with the problem, having accepted Professor Winters' assurance that it was beyond their capabilities. May smiled as Lynn sat down beside her. "You look like you haven't slept," she whispered. "Don't tell me you've been working on that problem all weekend." Lynn nodded, too tired to deny it. "Any luck?" May asked, her voice betraying her doubt that even Lynn could have made progress on such a difficult problem. Before Lynn could answer, Professor Winters strode in, his presence immediately commanding attention. He surveyed the room with a satisfied expression, clearly pleased by the impact his challenge had made. "Good morning," he began. "I trust you all had a chance to consider our little problem over the weekend." His tone suggested he knew most hadn't bothered to try. "Before we return to our regular curriculum, I thought I'd share some thoughts on why this particular problem has proven so resistant to elegant solutions." He picked up a piece of chalk and began annotating the equations already on the board, highlighting key aspects. Lynn followed his explanation, silently comparing it to her own understanding of the problem's structure. "The essential difficulty," Professor Winters continued, "lies in the chaotic nature of the transformations involved. The system exhibits sensitive dependence on initial conditions, making it virtually impossible to find a closed-form expression for the invariant measure." Reynolds raised his hand. "Professor, I tried using a Fourier transform approach over the weekend, but the resulting series doesn't converge." "A reasonable attempt, Mr. Reynolds." Professor Winters nodded approvingly. "Several researchers at Stanford pursued a similar path with similar results. The function simply has too many discontinuities for a Fourier approach to yield a compact solution." Several other students shared their failed attempts, each receiving Professor Winters' encouraging but ultimately dismissive response. Lynn sat quietly, her hand occasionally rising halfway before she lost her nerve and lowered it again. "Well," Professor Winters said finally, "I hope this exercise has given you all a taste of real mathematical research. The frustration, the false starts, the moments of insight that ultimately lead nowhere, these are all part of the process." He began to erase the board. "Now let's return to our regular—" "Wait!" The word escaped Lynn's lips before she could stop it, loud enough to make Professor Winters pause with the eraser still in his hand. The classroom fell silent as all eyes turned toward her. "Yes, Ms. Lynn?" Professor Winters asked, a note of impatience in his voice. Lynn swallowed hard. Her heart pounded in her chest. For a moment she considered apologizing and letting the moment pass. But something inside her, perhaps the same instinct that had guided her through the mathematical labyrinth over the weekend, refused to remain silent. "I think I found a solution," she said, her voice soft but clear. A ripple of surprise moved through the room. Professor Winters lowered his eraser, his expression a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. "You believe you've found an elegant solution to the problem?" he asked, emphasizing the word elegant in a way that suggested he doubted it was possible. Lynn nodded. "I think so, yes." Reynolds laughed, not even trying to disguise his disbelief. "Seriously? When the best mathematicians in the country couldn't?" Professor Winters held up a hand to silence him. "Let's hear what Miss Lynn has to say." His tone was not encouraging, but it wasn't dismissive either, more the voice of someone willing to witness an interesting failure. "Would you like to explain your approach?" he asked. Lynn hesitated. Trying to explain the entire pathway of her thinking would be too complicated, too easy to get lost in details. And there was something else. A gut feeling that in this moment actions would speak louder than words. "Could I just show you?" she asked, rising from her seat. Professor Winters gestured toward the board. By all means. Lynn walked slowly to the front of the room, aware of every eye upon her. She could feel Reynolds' skeptical gaze boring into her back, could sense the mixture of curiosity and secondhand embarrassment from her classmates. No one, not even May, expected her to succeed. They were merely waiting to see how she would fail. Standing before the board, Lynn took a deep breath. The chalk felt small and fragile in her hand, but the equations before her were as clear as if they had been written in her own notebook. She could see the path through them now, the hidden symmetry, the elegant transformation that revealed the underlying structure. Lynn raised the chalk to the board and began to write. Her hand moved with quiet confidence, adding a new row of symbols below the original problem. It wasn't a direct attempt at a solution, but rather a transformation, a change of perspective that recast the entire problem in a different light. The classroom was utterly silent. Even Professor Winters stood perfectly still, his eyes tracking Lynn's chalk as it moved across the board. Lynn completed the transformation and then, without pausing, wrote the resulting simplification beneath it. The chaotic system, viewed through the lens of her transformation, revealed an unexpected order. 3 more lines of calculations followed, each flowing naturally from the one before, and then with a final flourish of chalk, she wrote the solution, a surprisingly compact expression that captured the invariant measure they had been seeking. Lynn took a step back from the board, suddenly aware that she had been holding her breath. She glanced at the old-fashioned clock on the wall and realized that only 17 seconds had passed since she first touched chalk to board. 17 seconds to solve what had been called impossible. The silence in the room deepened. Professor Winters stepped forward, his eyes moving rapidly over Lynn's work, checking each step, searching for flaws. Lynn waited, her heart still pounding but her mind calm. She knew her solution was correct. Professor Winters reached the final expression and stopped. He stared at it for several long moments, then turned to Lynn with an expression she had never seen on his face before, a mixture of astonishment and something that might have been respect. "This is," he began, then stopped, as if struggling to find the right words. "This transformation is remarkable. It reveals the underlying symmetry perfectly." He turned back to the board, pointing to her second line of calculations. "This step here, how did you see this?" Lynn shrugged slightly, unsure how to explain that it had simply come to her after hours of staring at the problem from every conceivable angle. "It just made sense to look at it this way." "Made sense," Professor Winters repeated softly, shaking his head in wonder. "Ms. Lynn, what you've done here is extraordinary. This solution is not only correct, it's beautiful, elegant in the truest mathematical sense." A murmur ran through the classroom. Students leaned forward in their seats, straining to see the board, suddenly realizing they were witnessing something unprecedented. "Is it really right?" someone whispered loudly enough to be heard. "Absolutely," Professor Winters replied, still studying the solution. "It's a completely novel approach. I've never seen this transformation applied to this class of problems before." He turned to Lynn. "Have you published this method elsewhere?" Lynn shook her head, fighting the urge to laugh at the absurdity of the question. When would she have published anything? Who would have published the work of an unknown student from a small coastal town? Then this is genuinely original work, Professor Winters said, more to himself than to the class. Remarkable. Lynn stood awkwardly at the front of the room, unsure what to do next. She glanced toward her seat, wanting nothing more than to return to the relative safety of the back row. Mr. Reynolds, Professor Winters said suddenly, would you care to verify Ms. Lynn's solution? I believe you spent considerable time with this problem over the weekend. Reynolds came forward slowly, his face a careful mask. He studied the board in silence, checking each step of Lynn's work with obvious reluctance. Finally, he turned to Professor Winters. It's correct, he admitted, his voice flat. The transformation is unusual, but it works. Not just unusual, Professor Winters corrected. It's inspired. He turned to address the entire class. What Ms. Lynn has done here is precisely what I was talking about on Friday, finding the key insight that reveals the hidden structure of a problem. This is mathematics at its finest. Lynn felt her face growing warm at the unexpected praise. She glanced around the room and saw a range of expressions on her classmates' faces. Surprise, confusion, reassessment. May was beaming at her from the back row, giving her a subtle thumbs up. May I return to my seat now? Lynn asked quietly. Professor Winters nodded, still distracted by the solution on the board. Yes, of course. Thank you, Ms. Lynn. This is quite something. As Lynn walked back to her seat, she felt a strange lightness in her steps. For the first time since arriving at the university, she moved through the room not as a ghost trying to avoid notice, but as herself, a mathematician who had earned her place. What had changed was not just how others saw her, but how she saw herself. In those 17 seconds at the board, something had shifted irrevocably. The girl who had spent her life being overlooked had finally been seen, not for her appearance or her background, but for the brilliance of her mind, and that was a kind of victory that no one could take away. The campus had changed, or perhaps it was Lynn who had changed. As she walked across the quad on a bright spring morning 3 months after her 17-second solution, she noticed details that had always been there, but somehow seemed different now. The way sunlight filtered through the oak trees, the friendly nods from students she passed, the sense of belonging that had gradually replaced her feeling of being an outsider. Word had spread quickly after that day in Professor Winters' class. By lunchtime, graduate students from the mathematics department were approaching her in the cafeteria, asking to see her notes. By the end of the week, she had been invited to join a research group led by Professor Winters himself, a privilege usually reserved for doctoral candidates. The solution, which soon became known in the department as Lynn's transformation, had turned out to be even more significant than initially thought. When Professor Winters presented it at a conference in February, mathematicians from leading institutions recognized its potential applications beyond the original problem. 3 papers had since been published with Lynn as co-author, and her inbox regularly contained emails from researchers around the world asking for her insights on related problems. Lynn pushed open the heavy door of the mathematics building, smiling at the familiar smell of chalk dust in old books. The hallway was busy with students rushing to morning classes, but unlike before, many of them greeted her by name. Lynn, wait up! She turned to see May hurrying toward her, weaving through the crowd with her usual energy. Did you hear? May asked, slightly breathless as she fell into step beside Lynn. Professor Winters wants to see you in his office before the seminar. Something about the summer research program. Lynn nodded. He sent me an email last night. I'm heading there now. Any idea what it's about? May asked. The deadline for applications was weeks ago. Not really, Lynn admitted. Maybe he wants me to help review some of the submissions? May grinned. Or maybe they're creating a special position just for you. Mathematical genius in residence. Lynn laughed and shook her head. Despite everything that had happened, she still felt uncomfortable with too much attention or praise. The quiet, unassuming part of her nature hadn't disappeared, even as her confidence had grown. They reached Professor Winters' office, and May gave her an encouraging nod before continuing down the hall to their shared study space. Lynn knocked gently on the door. Come in, called the familiar voice. Lynn entered to find Professor Winters sitting behind his desk, which was covered in its usual organized chaos of papers, journals, and mathematical models. The wall behind him was lined with bookshelves, and a large window offered a view of the campus grounds. What was unusual, however, was the presence of another person in the room. A tall woman in a tailored suit who stood examining the framed mathematical prints on the wall. "Ah, Ms. Lynn," Professor Winters said, standing to greet her. "Thank you for coming. I'd like you to meet Dr. Rivera, the director of the Advanced Mathematical Institute at Berkeley." Lynn felt a jolt of surprise as the woman turned and smiled warmly at her. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you." "Lynn," Dr. Rivera said, extending her hand. "I've heard a great deal about your work." Lynn shook her hand, momentarily speechless. The Advanced Mathematical Institute was one of the most prestigious research centers in the country, known for bringing together the brightest minds to work on groundbreaking problems. "Please, have a seat," Professor Winters gestured to a chair. "Dr. Rivera has something she'd like to discuss with you." Lynn sat down, her mind racing with questions. Why would the director of such an important institute want to meet her? She was just a second-year undergraduate, still at the beginning of her mathematical journey. Dr. Rivera sat across from her, her expression thoughtful. "I've been following the development of your transformation method with great interest," she began. "The papers you've co-authored with Professor Winters have caused quite a stir in our community." Lynn nodded, unsure how to respond. "What you might not realize," Dr. Rivera continued, "is how widely applicable your approach has proven to be. Teams at MIT and Princeton have already applied variations of your method to problems in quantum field theory and complex dynamical systems." "I didn't know that," Lynn said softly, a mixture of pride and disbelief washing over her. "Which brings me to the purpose of my visit." Dr. Rivera leaned forward slightly. "The Institute runs a special summer program for exceptional young mathematicians, those who have demonstrated unusual creativity and insight. We provide resources, mentorship, and collaboration opportunities that aren't available elsewhere." She paused, letting her words sink in. "I'd like to invite you to join us this summer. You would be the youngest participant in the program's history, but after discussing your work with colleagues and with Professor Winters, we believe you've earned this opportunity." Lynn stared at her, trying to process what she was hearing. A summer at the Advanced Mathematical Institute? Working alongside some of the most brilliant mathematicians in the world? "This is an extraordinary opportunity, Lynn," Professor Winters added. "The kind that can shape an entire career." I don't know what to say," Lynn stammered. Dr. Rivera smiled. "Say yes. We'll take care of the logistics, housing, stipend, everything you need. All you have to bring is that remarkable mind of yours." Lynn looked from Dr. Rivera to Professor Winters and back again, a slow smile spreading across her face. "Then yes. Absolutely yes. Excellent." Dr. Rivera stood, clearly pleased. "I'll have my assistant send you all the details. We start on June 15th. After a few more minutes of discussion and a flurry of handshakes, Dr. Rivera left for another meeting, leaving Lynn alone with Professor Winters. "I must say," he said, leaning back in his chair, "watching your journey these past few months has been one of the highlights of my teaching career." Lynn smiled, remembering how intimidating she had once found him. Their relationship had evolved dramatically since that day she solved the impossible problem. He had become not just a teacher, but a mentor, challenging her with increasingly complex problems and guiding her development as a mathematician. "Thank you for everything," she said sincerely. "I wouldn't be here without your guidance." Professor Winters shook his head. "Don't sell yourself short. You had this gift long before you met me." He paused, his expression becoming more serious. "Though I do regret not recognizing it sooner. I was too quick to make assumptions based on, well, on superficial things that had nothing to do with your mathematical ability." Lynn appreciated his honesty. They had never directly discussed how he and others had overlooked her in those early days. But this acknowledgement meant a great deal. "What matters is now," she said simply. Professor Winters nodded. "Indeed, and speaking of now, don't you have a seminar to lead in 15 minutes? Lynn glanced at her watch and jumped up. "You're right. I should go prepare." As she hurried down the hallway toward the seminar room where a group of first-year students would be waiting for her tutorial session on differential equations, Lynn reflected on how much had changed. 3 months ago, she had been just another face in the crowd, trying to prove she belonged. Now she was helping others find their way through the mathematical landscape she loved so deeply. The seminar room was already half full when she arrived. Students looked up as she entered, their expressions respectful and attentive. Among them was a quiet girl who reminded Lynn of herself, sitting slightly apart from the others, her notebook already open, her eyes watching everything with careful observation. Lynn smiled at her, receiving a hesitant smile in return. "Let's get started," she said to the group, picking up a piece of chalk. "Today we're going to explore some elegant approaches to solving systems of differential equations." As she began writing on the board, Lynn found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her here. From a small coastal town to this moment, leading a seminar at one of the country's top universities with a summer at the Advanced Mathematical Institute ahead of her. The path hadn't been easy, but each challenge had shaped her. Each obstacle had made her stronger. After the seminar, as the students filed out, the quiet girl approached Lynn's desk. "Excuse me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I wanted to ask about something you mentioned, the geometric interpretation of the solution space." Lynn recognized something in the girl's manner, the careful way she phrased her question, the depth of understanding behind it that she was trying not to show too boldly. "That's a fascinating aspect," Lynn replied warmly. "Actually, I have some extra notes on that topic that might help. Would you like to go through them together?" The girl's face lit up. "Really, you wouldn't mind?" "Not at all," Lynn said, gesturing to a chair beside her desk. "I had someone who took time to help me once. It made all the difference." As they dove into the mathematics, Lynn felt a profound sense of things coming full circle. Her journey wasn't just about personal achievement or recognition. It was about creating space for others like her, those whose brilliance might be hidden behind quiet exteriors or unconventional backgrounds. Later that evening, Lynn sat in her favorite spot in the library, the desk by the window overlooking the pond. The campus was peaceful at this hour, the setting sun casting long shadows across the grass. She opened her notebook to a blank page and began exploring a new problem that had been occupying her thoughts lately, something about the intersection of topology and algebraic structures that felt like it might lead somewhere interesting. As her pencil moved across the page, Lynn smiled to herself. Mathematics had always been her sanctuary, her true home. But now, instead of a solitary refuge from a world that overlooked her, it had become a bridge connecting her to a community of like minds, a path leading to places she had once only dreamed about. The 17 seconds that had changed everything hadn't really been about proving herself to others. They had been about claiming her rightful place in the world, not as the plain woman that others had dismissed, but as exactly who she was. A mathematician with a unique way of seeing the universe of numbers, patterns and possibilities, and that was something no one could ever take away.